Christmas is not cancelled, but please do make any celebrations as small as they possibly can be. That was the message from Boris Johnson today, who has stuck to his own personal tradition of shifting public health advice on an almost daily basis. But will the shift in tone be enough to limit the spike in the new year to below the level of deaths Britain's scientists most fear? That's the not particularly festive question me and Aaron will be addressing today. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing very well, Michael. How are you doing?
Very well. I was going to ask you your plans for Christmas, actually, but we'll wait until we're properly on that segment. And we are also going to talk tonight about a blow for campaigners against Heathrow Expansion. That's because of a decision that's been made in the Supreme Court. Dominic Cummings' pay rise. I'm sure you've heard about that one already. And we are going to end by speaking to Paul Sweeney, former MP for Glasgow North East, who we've had on the show a few times, about the fairly shocking level of drug-related deaths that are currently being recorded in Scotland. As ever, if you have any strong opinions about what we're saying, do tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour or send us your super chats and do share the show link. The government has been under intense pressure to tighten rules on Christmas socialising. SAGE are reportedly increasingly concerned about a big January spike, and the British Medical Journal and British Health Journal put out a joint editorial yesterday calling for a change to the relaxation of the rules which have been promised by our government. However, we are told no changes to those rules will be forthcoming. The subject formed the basis of this heated exchange at PMQs.
And it's now likely that the next big mistake will be over the easing of restrictions over Christmas. And this isn't smarmy lawyers. Let me give you the British Medical Journal. The British Medical Journal yesterday said this: "We believe the government is about to blunder into another major error that will cost many lives." The Prime Minister should listen to that advice, not just ignore it as usual. And if he really is going to press ahead with this, can he tell us what's the assessment, and has it been done, of the impact that it will have on infection rates and increased pressure on the NHS? What's the impact?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I wish he'd have the guts just to say what he really wants to do, which is to cancel the plans people have made and cancel Christmas. I think that's what he's driving at, Mr. Speaker. He's looking a bit blank. I think that's what he's driving at. But I can tell him that as of today, and just this morning, there is actually, as I say, unanimous agreement across all the UK government, across all the devolved administrations, including members of all parties, Mr. Speaker, including his own, that we should proceed in principle with the existing regulations, Mr. Speaker, because we don't want to criminalise people's long-made plans, Mr. Speaker, but we do think it's absolutely vital that people should, at this very, very tricky time, exercise a high degree of personal responsibility, especially when they come into contact with elderly people, and avoid contact with elderly people wherever possible. And that is how, by being sensible and cautious, not by imposing endless lockdowns or cancelling Christmas, as he would appear to want to do. That's the only implication I can draw from what he said, Mr. Speaker, unless he wants to announce some other idea. That is the way we will continue to work together to keep this virus under control, to defeat it and take the country forward.
So Johnson there trying to claim that Keir Starmer, by asking any questions, is essentially being the Grinch who wants to cancel Christmas. Interestingly, immediately after that announcement from Boris Johnson that there had been consensus between the four nations about keeping the regulations the same, Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, announced they would be changing their advice to reduce Christmas bubbles from 3 households to 2. However, to square that circle, to be fair to him, the rules are staying the same everywhere. That's going to be strong advice from the Welsh government to not have free households, but just to have 2. Throughout the UK, the rules will stay the same, but the tone of the government has dramatically shifted, the tone of the British government, the UK government. 3 hours after that exchange you just watched at PMQs, Boris Johnson hosted a press conference.
We're keeping the laws the same, but we all want to send the same message. A smaller Christmas is going to be a safer Christmas, and a shorter Christmas is a safer Christmas. When we say 3 households can meet on 5 days, I want to stress that these are maximums, not targets to aim for. And of course, it's always going to be safest to minimise the number of people you meet. And that means that if you're visiting others over Christmas, we're asking you in the 5 days beforehand, as early as this Friday, to reduce the number of people you're in contact with to the lowest possible, because obviously this virus spreads through human contact. If possible, don't travel from a high prevalence to a low prevalence area, and avoid staying away from home overnight if you can.
He also had this pretty memorable slogan.
So, have yourselves a merry little Christmas. And I'm afraid this year I do mean little.
That one was actually, many Boris Johnson slogans are very annoying. I think that one was actually all right. Now, there's been big debate on Twitter about this announcement. Is it completely incoherent for the government to say the rules are that you can have up to 3 households for 5 days, but we're strongly recommending to you that you don't do that and that you hang out for as short a period as possible. So for only 1 day, they're saying don't travel long distances even though you are allowed to. And the debate this has started, is it incoherent to have advice which is different from the rules? Now, I personally don't think so. I actually think this is actually a reasonable place to have arrived at, to say that these are going to be the rules. We understand that some people are going to be in situations where they are going to want to gather in larger groups for a longer period of time. However, we strongly advise you don't do that. And if I were the government, I'd be setting an example. I'd be saying, I won't be doing that. I'm the Prime Minister. I'm not going to be hanging out with elderly relatives. And we've seen actually the opposite happening. So my problem here is not where we've arrived at, but how we got here, and the fact that it's very, very close to Christmas, and they've only just worked out that this could be incredibly dangerous. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this. On a personal level, will you be seeing older relatives this Christmas? But also, what do you feel about this position that the government have landed at, that we are allowing you to do something quite risky, even if we advise you not to do it?
Well, I think the position of the government's going to probably play quite well with the public. I thought that the line Johnson deployed against Keir Starmer is he wants to cancel Christmas. I think that will work. I think Labour will be terrified of being represented as the party which is going to cancel Christmas. Personally speaking, we're going to have 3 households here probably, but it's helped by the fact that my dad's already had COVID, so he has the antibodies. Had he not had COVID, it might be a different calculation because he has asthma, he's over 65. I'm sorry, sorry, Dad, he's 64. So it might be a different calculation, but the way we're looking at it is, we've got basically 2 households coming together who haven't had COVID. So, I think we'll be cautious. The whole 5-day thing is ridiculous, and I never really understood it. But I think on Christmas Day, I think it's probably fair to show a certain amount of latitude because ultimately it wouldn't be enforceable, the idea of cancelling Christmas. So I can see why the government's done what it's done. I think relaxing restrictions in the way that it did going weeks back, I think was unwise. I think doing this for 5 days is unwise. But in a way, it makes more sense to have an expansive period of time which people can sort of, prepare for, and then reduce it rather than say, oh, actually, we were going to give you just Christmas Day, but actually now we're going to Boxing Day as well. So I think that's the right way around. It's a funny one. I just don't see how Labour could adopt any sort of different position on it fundamentally.
Well, again, I think we agree that where they've arrived is not a particularly bad place, but it is, somewhat ridiculous that they didn't see this coming. And this has applied at every single stage of this pandemic where they've had to take inevitable decisions. I think it was always inevitable they were going to have to strengthen the advice to not hang out in such large groups as they were originally suggesting. And they could have worked it out at the beginning of the month. They could have worked out that loosening the lockdown as they did on the 2nd of December would end up looking pretty problematic by the point where we had a second spike, or a third spike, in fact, just as we were coming up to any loosening at Christmas. And this especially, sort of the ridiculousness of this, especially applies to travel, because quite rightly today, Boris Johnson has accepted, and Chris Whitty was very clear, that we want you to keep it local. So he's saying, please don't travel across the country for Christmas unless you really, really need to. Obviously, whether or not you really need to is going to be a subjective decision for people to make. But they're saying, we don't want you to move if at all possible. And we especially don't want you to travel across the country from a high prevalence area to a low prevalence area, because that would mean that you could seed the virus. Now, again, as I say, this is all very sensible. The problem is that it doesn't sit very well with announcements that the government made very, very recently. So this is from the government website 4 days ago, only 4 days ago, on the 12th of December. The Transport Secretary announces up to £3 million for coach services to meet Christmas travel demand. It's a funding package announced to support coach travel over Christmas. Now, according to this press release from the government, they say this £3 million would help fund an additional 80,000 seats on coaches. And the press release also boasts that hundreds of miles of roadworks will be lifted and rail ticket charges reduced. This was the quote Transport Secretary Grant Shapps gave in that press release. So he said, "We've already set out important measures so journeys can run as smoothly as possible this Christmas. Today's funding announcement for the coach sector goes one step further, ensuring there are more options available for people wanting to travel to celebrate with loved ones and friends." Now, you can see what's ridiculous here, which is just they're giving you one message on, I suppose this is Sunday. They're giving you one message on Sunday and a completely different one on Wednesday. So on Sunday, they're saying, look, we're providing more coach services. Now, they could say, oh, this is because we know people are going to travel anyway, and we want them to be sitting as far apart as possible, so we actually need there to be more rather than less coach services. But obviously, you look at the wording there, you look at the tone here, you look at the fact that this is in a press release, they are normalizing the idea that you should be traveling across the country to visit family and friends, to celebrate Christmas with loved ones and friends. That's in the press release. So I just think that this has come from the completely wrong angle. And we said this weeks ago on this show. So again, this is the kind of thing where Boris Johnson will call everyone else Captain Hindsight. But it was really obvious that what the government should have been doing from the get-go is to say, what we really don't want you to do is meet up in large groups with multiple households in enclosed spaces. We know that Christmas is actually a time when people are speaking quite loudly. There's fun and games. This is really going to be a hotbed for transmission, especially if you're meeting younger people with older people, or putting younger people and older people in the same room. And you had people like, it was Grant Shapps, we talked about it on the show actually. No, it was George Eustice, my apologies. George Eustice, who'd been saying, I'm going to spend Christmas with my in-laws, who are, you presume, going to be fairly elderly. And there has been no leadership on this at all in terms of messaging, and it could all have been foreseen. There are some people, Aaron, that are saying that Boris Johnson might come to regret not actually changing the rules, because it does seem possible that we could see a much bigger spike in deaths in January than other countries where they've had much more consistent public health messaging on this, or indeed slightly stricter rules. I think in Germany you're allowed 4 people over from your close family. So that, I suppose, presumably is a bit lower than here, where you can have any number of people from 2 extra households. So do you think, whilst this is clearly a popular move, or popular's maybe overstepping it, but it's kind of the Goldilocks position to say that we are going to encourage you to take caution, but we're not going to ruin any plans that you already had. Do you think this could come back to bite Boris Johnson in the arse come January?
I don't think so. No, I think today, for instance, we've had more than 600 people die today in the last sort of wave of announcements. How you
reported in the last 24 hours.
Exactly. People say, well, was it the primary cause of death, etc. But we're still in that ballpark figure of multiple hundreds of people dying every day from this thing. And how many people watching this knew that? How many people were aware that was the figure? It's no longer headline news. If it's not in December, will it be in January? I don't know. What I found really revealing was that Boris Johnson, I think it was in the PMQ's clip, he talks about how we'll keep this virus under control. Keep is the key word here. The virus hasn't been under control since March. Even when we had these incredibly draconian lockdown measures, we were still seeing an astonishing number of people die. The UK's now gone beyond 65,000 COVID deaths, it seems. Maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less. So how can you have the temerity when the nightclubs are open in Wuhan, when people are watching sports events in Australia, to say, we're going to keep this thing under control? We've just had 65,000 people die. We're seeing it spike again. We're having a debate about whether or not we should cancel Christmas. It's remarkable. And I do think questions should be asked about the Labour leadership as well. if you can't land punches on a prime minister, saying something so utterly absurd in the sort of eye of the storm, when are you going to do it? And Labour have moved away from the whole refrain of we'll support the government where necessary, but now they're not really even attacking them. I don't quite get what Labour's strategy is here. This should have been a car crash PMQs for Boris Johnson, and it wasn't. And I think the blame for that has to primarily be laid at the feet of Keir Starmer. We've seen a deluge of other terrible stories over the last several days. One particularly about child malnourishment, food deprivation in this country. Nothing from Labour. And so I don't think, given the sort of the political and rhetorical style of the front bench, given how lazy the media is, but I think fundamentally how fatigued people are with the story in general. No, I don't think it'll be a sort of big news story in January if we see a spike again. Because this time, what's different is there's a light at the end of the tunnel. People will be being vaccinated. Now, if there was no vaccine, I think it would be a very, very, very different conversation. I think people, frankly, would be in uproar. I don't think people could, handle another 6 months like the last 6 months. But that isn't what we're faced with right now. So I think the Tories will be able to weather it.
I probably agree with you on this one. PMQs was interesting, actually. They sort of finished it today. If you didn't watch it yourselves, I don't expect many of our audience watch the whole thing. It can be fairly tedious, but they sort of had clearly Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer settled into what were their default critiques of the other party, or the other, their opposite number. So Boris Johnson was saying or we'll start with Keir Starmer, actually, because he starts with the attack at PMQs, obviously. So he's constantly trying to make out Boris Johnson to be an unserious person, to not be a competent person. He sort of read out a local Tory party newsletter, which was making a joke about how you can basically just stand up and say whatever you're thinking, whether or not it's relevant to the point in hand. Sort of, they were basically implying that's how Boris Johnson behaves. Keir Starmer was like, is this really how one gets ahead in politics? And in response, Boris Johnson immediately says, well, what we're waiting for from you, Keir Starmer, is a position on something. Maybe you could get a position for Christmas. I don't know if he used that exact line, but you could see that's where they're settling. Keir Starmer, shifty, doesn't believe in anything. Boris Johnson, not serious, incompetent. And I expect, I don't think that's going to change. It seems like we sort of settled into a bit of a rut there, and they seem fairly neck and neck in that rut. Let's go to a couple of super chats. Eric Williamson with $3. Ash for official Brexit and Royals correspondent. Do you mean official Navarra Brexit and Royals correspondent? Because to be honest, she can have that title. And she's definitely not going anywhere. So yeah, she can be the official Navarra if she wants. I know she wants Royals. To be honest, I'm not sure she'd want Brexit correspondent. I think you'd struggle to actually assign that role within Navarra Media. JM, no one's gonna put their hand up immediately in the morning Slack meeting. JM with €50, expat now living in Berlin who just got a job. So here's a Christmas bonus, and you've got another regular donor. Hashtag Free Palestine. Hashtag Justice for Grenfell, and hashtag I am with farmers. I assume being a reference to the protests currently going on in India. Thank you so much, JM. We'll go on to our next story. In February, England's Court of Appeal found that the government's policy for airport expansion was unlawful, as it didn't meet with up-to-date climate targets, or the government hadn't considered up-to-date climate targets when they made the decision. Therefore, the decision to approve Heathrow expansion in 2018 was judged to be invalid. However, Heathrow has since appealed that decision, and today the Supreme Court has ruled in the airport's favour. They judged that the decision had been made according to the law because whilst it's not according to the current targets, it was according to the targets which were in place when the decision was made. Heathrow have now confirmed they will be seeking planning permission to go ahead with the project. So this doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen. It just removes a barrier in the way of Heathrow expansion, which had been put there by that decision by the Court of Appeal earlier this year. That's now gone. But the government, again, will get the ultimate final say. So it's going to become a political question once again. So does this ruling mean Heathrow expansion will go ahead? Earlier today, I spoke to Leo Murray, Director of Innovation at climate change charity Possible, who's campaigned against Heathrow expansion for the last 15 years.
The public mood in Britain has changed a lot on climate change over the last couple of years. And in particular, we've got record numbers of people who say they are concerned or extremely concerned about this and demanding action. So the appetite for action on climate change has massively gone up. And so I think the calculus when it comes to the public has changed. And the politics of this what we've just seen this year with COVID is the aviation industry, in a bit of poetic justice in a way, because they were so instrumental in spreading the virus in the first place and resisting curbs on travel by air, international travel by air. A lot of industry experts just do not expect business travel to ever recover to previous levels of demand. And that is because business travel has been in decline for a while, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. Flights from UK airports, international business flights account for fewer than 1 in 10 flights by UK residents abroad now. And that's because nothing to do with climate change. That is just business travel losing market share to video conferencing effectively. And initially that was just early adopters. So that was businesses that, far-sighted businesses realized they could save money this way. But what's happened this year is the intransigent businesses, the businesses where there's loads of inertia around practices and everything, and who've stuck to these face-to-face meetings, very costly face-to-face meetings, have discovered this year that actually it's not really an impediment to doing business, not being able to fly people around. And so, the expectation is there will be big change in the culture around practices at businesses. Now, business flights are only a small share of the total, but they're the profitable part of the industry. That's where the big money is for airlines. And so it's really unclear that demand overall is ever going to recover to previous levels. Now, investors at Heathrow will be only too aware of this. So the fact that the court says, yes, okay, go ahead and submit a planning application, I don't know if we're even going to see that happen, because the pressure to demand to expand the airport, which prevailed up until COVID, it's just not clear that pressure is going to be there anymore.
So Leo Murray, fairly optimistic there. I'll go to Aaron's thoughts in one moment. First of all, let's go through the political response to this decision by the Supreme Court. So the government are yet to commit either way, but ministers have been advised by their climate change committee that in order to keep emissions down, Heathrow should only expand if regional airports contract. Now that's going to be very difficult for them to do, given they've said we want to level up the country, we want to sort of prioritise infrastructure and development outside of the southeast. It's difficult to see how that would work. So they'd have to go against the advice of the Climate Change Committee if they were to approve a third runway. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is still opposed. We can get up his tweet today. This decision to allow Heathrow Airport a third runway will have a damaging impact on air quality, noise and London's ability to achieve net zero carbon by 2030. I urge Heathrow to drop these damaging plans and work with us on a cleaner, greener recovery. And Labour's Transport Secretary said Heathrow Expansion has not yet met the tests on air quality, noise pollution, delivering countrywide economic benefits and enabling us to meet our obligations on climate change. So they're sounding not particularly warm about the prospects of a third runway, but it's fairly conditional. It's more tests. And we know that Keir Starmer loves tests, although it's a fairly similar position to that which it was under Jeremy Corbyn. Aaron, where do you stand on all of this? If you were a betting man, would you put money on a third runway happening at Heathrow, or do you think this is now a non-starter despite this decision by the Supreme Court?
No, I agree entirely with what we just heard from your guests a moment ago. That moment's gone. We probably won't see the level of aviation traffic that we saw at the end of last year for another 10 years, maybe never again. Whole fleets of carriers have basically grounded. They're saying till 2021, maybe till 2022. I think 2022 is probably quite a reasonable estimate. Now, the counterpoint would be, big infrastructural projects, they take time anyway. This is actually more reason to do it now. But I don't think that's going to wash. Firstly, the Climate Change Commission said that the number one cause of CO2 emissions in the whole of the country, the number one source, is Heathrow Airport. Now, you can't be serious about reducing CO2 emissions if you're making the number one source even bigger. Furthermore, 15% of people account for 70% of CO2 emissions when it comes to flights. So the idea that we all need Heathrow to get bigger simply isn't true. It serves a very narrow interest of people in this country. And again, it's important to say that many of those people will actually now just prefer to use teleconferencing services, Zoom, StreamYard, whatever, Maybe a year ago, that wasn't really the option. Culturally, things have changed. Technologically, people are feeling a bit more comfortable with it. A lot of big businesses now have a new role since COVID, head of remote. You're not going to create a new role and then a year later be paying hundreds of thousands of pounds for plane tickets and get your CFO, your head of finances getting that signed off. It's probably not likely, especially when people are having to engage with such difficult economic circumstances. So I agree. I think it's almost certainly not going to happen. But what's really interesting is it was only in 2018 that there was a parliamentary vote on Heathrow expansion, and it was something like 410 MPs to 120 MPs for expansion. And a lot of Labour MPs voted for expansion. Jeremy Corbyn didn't, John McDonnell didn't. But it wasn't even a majority position really within the Labour Party to oppose this. And what's remarkable is that's mid-2018, fast forward slightly more than 2 years, and absolutely nobody is making the case for this anymore. Nobody is saying it'll drive economic growth, because it won't. Nobody's saying it will create jobs, because it won't. We heard all of that in the early 1990s with Heathrow Terminal 5. It was complete fiction. My God, go to an airport and see how many jobs there are. Right, you're looking at, in many aspects, at one of the most highly automated parts of the modern economy that we all interact with. Completely different environment to 20, 25 years ago. Of course, some new jobs have been created in security, for instance, but it's clearly not. It's not going to drive a massive increase in jobs. So the idea that the aviation sector is going to create jobs was always nonsense. COVID-19 has probably put a stake through the heart. So not good for jobs, not good for growth, certainly not good for climate emissions. And for the vast majority of the public, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Just to finish, to return to the Climate Change Commission, one of the suggestions they put forward actually was a levy on frequent flyers, to help fund decarbonisation. What this would mean, if it happens, and I think it won't, is the precise opposite. The people who are already making lots of flights, making lots of these decisions to emit huge amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, killing the planet for future generations, well, let's give them more carrying capacity. That's not right. It's not good. And the idea that decarbonising means we necessarily have lower economic growth, and by the way, I don't really care either way. I'm perfectly happy for a steady state economy of sorts in the medium term. We also know probably isn't true. The Climate Change Committee last week talked about the fact that you could probably decarbonise around 75% on 1990 levels at a cost of 1% of GDP. So there's no real way of looking at the argument for a third runway that makes sense, whether it's noise pollution, whether it's the economy, whether it's climate change. So yes, of course, some vested interests want this thing built, but ultimately it's not going to happen, because I don't think the people they want in those planes will be going in them from 2021 onwards.
Yeah, I do. Obviously, I agree with that. I don't think there is any rational argument for having a third runway. I'm not that confident demand is going to fall away, because I do think we might have a bit of a sort of post-vaccine roaring 2020s where everyone goes out to bars and goes on holidays more than they had before. People have saved quite a lot of money now, and I think there are many people who are like, God, I want to go away now. Before I kind of took this all for granted. So I do think it's, as you say, the Commission for Climate Change have said that we need to put a levy on these things. And I do think that is probably an argument that has to be made, because it's, in a way, aviation is the awkward issue for climate change campaigners, because what people on the left like to do, quite rightly, involved in the Green New Deal, is to say this isn't about austerity, this isn't about consuming less, this is about investment and innovation in those sectors of the economy where we can reduce emissions. This doesn't have to be about us consuming less and living, less fulfilled lives. But with aviation, because it seems so difficult to make a green form of aviation, very difficult. It does seem like we are going to have to take fewer flights, and there probably will have to be some regulations to make that happen. As you said, I was speaking to Leo after this. He also mentioned that very important statistic: 15% of the population take 70% of the flights. And he also told me on any given year, 50% of the population don't take a flight. So you have to think, if we were given one flight a year, which is quite plausible, then that would be enough for at least 50% of the population. So if there were something, where you got a dramatically increasing levy for every second flight you took in a year, going up from 2 to 3 to 4, etc., that would massively reduce emissions, and it wouldn't affect that many people at all. So one that I don't really expect any political party to be taking on in the short term, because it's probably not going to be immediately possible, but quite likely the kind of thing we will need to see down the line. Well, obviously we need to see it right now, but it takes time for public opinion to shift on these things and for people to understand the urgency of this particular issue. A couple of comments. Maggie Gardner with a fiver. Zoom Christmas versus COVID. I know what I'm choosing. Not prepared to throw away a year's worth of restrictions, mask wearing and social distancing. I agree with you there. I think I'm doing well. I'm going to see my friends of not vulnerable age this Christmas. Jim Jam, although no judgment to anyone who is seeing their family. Jim Jam with a tenner. You guys have got me through lockdown. I would give more, but it's our first Xmas with our new edition. Oh, things are tight. Peace, Jim Jam. Thank you for your donation. Congratulations. I assume that's a baby that you've had. Congratulations. Enjoy your first Christmas with them. We are going to be back in a moment to talk about Dominic Cummings and then a pretty worrying story coming out of Scotland. So don't go anywhere. But for now, we have a quick video from Ash. It's an update on our year fundraiser.
Hello, as you may or may not be aware, we've been crowdfunding to raise £5,000 a month more in donations every month by this Christmas. And because of all your support, we smashed it. We've met our target with 2 weeks to go. Job done, everybody go home. Video's over, stop watching. Except it's not actually that simple. Because we've met that target, because of your kindness and your generosity, we have come up with a new one. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, stop shaking me upside down for my lunch money. You've already got everything that you're going to get. It's not going to cost you, already existing subscriber, a penny. We want 500 new supporters by the new year. And that means that if you're already a supporter, you already donate to us every month, get out there and talk to people. That's all we're asking of you. Chat to your flatmates, your friends, your family members, even the ones you don't like very much, and let them know what we do here at Novara Media. That what we are trying desperately to achieve is a modicum of media plurality so we could have some kind of progressive politic within our lifetimes. And we know that Christmas time can be a bit tight in terms of people's budgets, so don't worry about that whole donate an equivalent of 1 hour of your wage per month thing. Just any amount will do, as long as it's legal tender. It doesn't even have to be legal tender. We'll take Monopoly money this month. So if that sounds like something your friends or your loved ones or, frenemies might be interested in, go to novara.media/support. And Merry Christmas.
Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, was given at least a 40% pay increase this past year. So he saw his salary rise from 95k to 100k, so 95,000 to 100,000 pound pay bracket, to the 140,000 to 145,000 pay bracket. This is how pay is reported in government. Now, this is according to the annual report on pay transparency by the Cabinet Office. The pay rise will have made Cummings the joint highest earning political aide along with Lee Kane in Downing Street. With his pay being between 140k and 145k, he's earning almost as much as the Prime Minister, who is on £150,000. Now, controversially, this comes after a pay freeze for public sector workers such as police and firefighters. The Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, was on Sky this morning. Here's how he defended that pay rise.
Another of your colleagues, Dominic Cummings, once again in the headlines today, reported that he has had a 40% pay rise. What on earth is going on in government that someone hired on 100 grand can get an extra £40,000 in their pay packet?
Well, Dominic Cummings obviously left the government now, but I understand that he was given a pay rise to bring his salary broadly in line with those of his predecessors, other people who'd been
and the Prime Minister,
chief of staff to former Prime Ministers. This is a significant amount of money, obviously, but it's in line with, say, the chief executive of a medium-sized local council. And the amount of money that we spend on political advisors within government, both this government and its predecessors, is very small by international standards, a very small portion of the amount of money we spend on the broader civil service. And I think they do a good job for us.
40%
it's
pay
an important
rise.
function.
A 40% pay rise.
We are delivering on our promises at general elections, and it ensures the political impartiality of the civil service. So I think special advisors play an important role in our political process, but I completely understand that ensuring pay restraint amongst politicians and the public sector is going to be very important in a time when other people in the private sector are finding their wages squeezed.
So that was Robert Jenrick. As you might expect, Downing Street took a similar line. They had the same defence of Cummings' pay rise. This is Johnson's press secretary, Allegra Stratton. She said it's the correct level of salary for the role that Dominic Cummings performed. Not everyone, though, in the Conservative Party is willing to defend the pay rise. The Financial Times had some interesting quotes from other government aides and ministers. So they wrote, several government aides said they were told that pay had been all but frozen because of COVID-19. Dom lectured us pretty much weekly that in the People's Government, pay was not the object, said one advisor. Under Dom and Lee's dynasty, you wouldn't have dared ask for a pay rise. It would have been basically asking to be sacked. Another government aide described it as classic Dom, adding, he talks a good game, but is actually a massive disappointment. Ministers said Mr Cummings' pay rise looked very bad for the government. Dominic Cummings has done more than anyone else to retoxify the Conservative Party's image. First Barnard Castle, now this. Voters will look at this and say it's one rule for us and another for them, and they would be right, a member of the government said. We're going to give you some analysis of this story in one moment. First of all, if you're enjoying what you're seeing, do make sure you hit that subscribe button. As you know, we go live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. and we have videos going out every day on the Novara Media YouTube channel. Now, I want to focus on those defences that Jenrick and Stratton gave for a moment. So they say, look, he's getting paid the normal amount for the job he is doing. He clearly was, well, he's not anymore, but he was a very senior advisor to Boris Johnson, the most senior, in fact, and he was at the top of the pay scale for government advisors. You might think that makes sense. And on one level, it does. There are a couple of problems, though. So one, as those quotes from those civil servants suggest, or from those other advisors, those junior advisors, he wasn't supposed to be just any other government advisor. He was supposed to be, part of the people's government, an anti-establishment figure. He was supposed to accept that, people are, the median wage in this country is about 21k. So why should I be on 140k? Then he got into government. I mean, that's actually why his pay was lower to begin with, I think, because he went in there, he said, I'm a different kind of advisor. Then after a few months, he was like, oh, actually, you know what? I want the whole thing. The bigger problem, though, is the year that this happened, right? So the argument they're making is that it's normal for someone in Cummings' job to be earning £145,000, so that's what he should earn. But this wasn't a normal year. It's also normal for doctors and nurses to work a 40-hour week and not risk their lives when they go into hospitals because there isn't adequate PPE. That didn't happen this year. There'll be lots of doctors and nurses saying it's never normal for us to work 40 hours a week, but it should be. I'm pretty sure that's what's in the contract. You can say the same about teachers, right? It's normal that teachers shouldn't have to go into their workplace and risk catching a deadly virus from their students. That didn't happen this year. This year, teachers have been forced and told to go back into schools, even though there is a clear risk of catching a virus from their students, which presents a great risk of death for people who are within certain categories in terms of age or prior vulnerabilities. Aaron, I want to bring you in. This clearly isn't the worst thing that Cummings has done this year, giving himself this pay rise, but it still doesn't look good, does it? What do you make of this?
Well, Michael, I have an alternative. Rather than him get a 40% pay increase, what would have been far better, and I'm sure Dominic Cummings would have infinitely preferred it, was for us just all to clap. If we just clapped for Dominic Cummings, that would have been obviously more than adequate. After all, it's good enough for the NHS. Surely it's good enough for Dominic Cummings. I mean, it is absurd. And I think the argument you make there is incredibly acute. It's not a normal year. It's not a normal year to be locked inside your home for months on end. It's not a normal year for children and teachers to be risking their safety by simply going to school. And in that context, where you do have a Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, saying that we're going to have effectively austerity. He hasn't used that word because it's a forgotten word in British politics now, but they would call it pay restraint. We had the public sector pay freeze, for instance, except the NHS going forward for this year into next year. And yet his pay is going up 40%. So no, I think you're right. And I do think it's a big story. But what I think really bugs me the most is that, for instance, Allegra Stratton is saying, well, this is just a normal amount of money for a guy to get earning, working in number 10 Downing Street. First of all, it shouldn't be. And this isn't like socialist, prudishness and me being absurd and he's got bills to pay. The guy has a house in central London. What does he need the money for, right? He doesn't need the money for a deposit to buy a place. What does he need it for? You tell me what he needs it for. He doesn't need it for clothes. The guy dresses like a clown. We know that. What does he need it for? Kids' school fees, expensive holidays? I mean, he can't spend that money quickly enough. He obviously enjoys working. So I think, he doesn't need the money. It just seems a really strange thing for him to have gone after. But the response from Allegra Stratton is, well, this is normal. It just shows, for me anyway, that for these people, effectively, these huge, extraordinary sums of money are effectively chicken feed, right? There seems to be absolutely no gratitude about the fact that they're incredibly privileged to be earning that kind of money. We can have the debate, and some people will say they deserve it, others will say they don't deserve it. Some will say they work really hard, they don't work hard enough. Then that's fine. But at least if the public purse is giving you 6 times the median wage, you could at least be grateful for it. It reminds me of Boris Johnson when he was commenting on his income for writing at the Daily Telegraph, just sort of saying that's a bit of chicken feed. The guy was being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to write a column. And I think that really does speak to the fact of where these people are coming from and their economic and political and social backgrounds. We know Dominic Cummings' background, his wife's background, Allegra Stratton's background, Boris Johnson's background. They all come from incredibly privileged parts of society. And it's almost like the money is an afterthought, And to say, oh, well, somebody in local government gets this much money. Well, it's too much money. They shouldn't be getting that much money. I don't think anybody in government should be getting more than the Prime Minister. Sorry. And also the thing with Robert Jenrick when he said, maybe you can correct me here, Michael, maybe I wasn't paying attention. He said Dominic Cummings getting a 40% pay rise in 1 year proves that the government was delivering on its agenda. How does that make any sense whatsoever? So, no, they should be rightly torn to shreds on this, particularly because Dominic Cummings has always tried to articulate himself as a tribune of the people, somebody who was there for the left behind. Well, we know that pay in this country has effectively stagnated for 12 years, and in 1 year, his pay went up almost 50%. This is a man who couldn't be a bigger hypocrite. And the fact that he hasn't lasted there, I don't think should subtract from the story one bit. He really is a supreme charlatan in more ways than one, not just intellectually, but I also think in terms of his political commitments, a supreme charlatan. And you can be damn sure if this was the Labour Party and the boot was in the other foot, this would be a huge national story for weeks. Heads would roll. This would be different because the Tories play by different rules.
I know I have a sort of similar tendency to sometimes switch off when Robert Jenrick's speaking. I think the argument he was making is not so much that the 40% pay increase was proof that the government were doing a good job, but rather what Boris Johnson always does with regard to sort of test and trace in the NHS, where any criticism that comes, he says, to criticise me is to criticise the NHS. Robert Jenrick was saying, to criticise us would be to criticise the whole civil service, because many people with top jobs in local government and the civil service are also on 140k. So to criticise Dominic Cummings is to criticise the rest of the civil service. How dare you in the middle of a pandemic? The problem there being that the government are addicted to briefing against the civil service every time there is something that goes wrong. So they say, the reason we locked down, the reason testing wasn't working very well initially was because our civil servants are so complacent and they can't do their jobs properly. That was their justification for giving all of these contracts and all of these roles to people, or their mates, essentially, in the private sector, who then basically screwed things up and handed out millions and millions and millions of pounds to their chums. So it's an argument where, you say, the civil servant, local government officials, brilliant, when that's to deflect criticisms of Dominic Cummings' pay package. And then when you have a fuck up in terms of government policy implementation, they say, it's the terrible overpaid civil servants. So again, it's the complete opportunistic hand-picking of whichever argument best serves as a defense against the questioning you're being faced with, even if they're completely inconsistent with one another. I just want to go to you for one more point on this, Aaron, because I think there seems to almost be consensus now that what Dominic Cummings is going to be remembered as is a fraud. He was someone who has written long blog posts about how he's going to transform the civil service and make it more effective. Ultimately, he went in there, obsessively briefed against various people, didn't really achieve anything at all, and sort of walked out with his tail in between his legs. He had written as if he could do this job better than anyone possibly could. Everyone else was an idiot except for him. Then he found himself with that responsibility, and he was crap. He was really, really bad at that job. And there's sort of a second point which comes out of this, which is what you're seeing from sort of lots of political journalists now, is they're saying that now Dominic Cummings has gone, Boris Johnson can assert himself as a new consensual leader. People were suggesting that we've seen that today with him. Potentially, I'm not quite sure what the compromises are supposed to be, but they say he's taken a more consensual approach to shifting the advice on Christmas, and that he's more willing to bring people around the table now than under Dominic Cummings. I don't know if you think is that sort of silly Westminster lobby gossip, or do you think there could be something to that?
No, I think that's correct. I think Dominic Cummings is clearly somebody who's quite good with his back to the wall and where he's the underdog and the odds are against him. We saw it with Brexit. I think Johnson winning the majority he did, in June 2019 looked very unlikely. It was possible, but it looked very unlikely. Even getting a deal looked unlikely. So he's clearly good at that, but it's a very different mindset to be in government with a mandate and then to deliver on things and to project manage and to lead. Clearly, he's not very good at that. And I think you're right. I think he will be remembered as a bit of a charlatan, as somebody who just wasn't very good at his job. And again, it boils down to a certain understanding of how good things get done. How do big projects happen? As a socialist, I'm going to say it's cooperation, but it's true. That's one of the great insights that Marx had about capitalism. He said, yes, you have private enterprise, but actually, the more complex capitalism becomes, the greater it draws upon the innate cooperative capacities of human beings. A great example is the modern firm. The modern firm is often incredibly centralized, huge division of labor, and there's a great deal of cooperation. And Marx would say, well, this is drawing upon our natural sort of aptitudes and tendencies as a species. Of course, not necessarily in the interests of the social interests of human beings. However, it shows the basis of organizing society differently. We are more prone to cooperation than competition. Now, what Dominic Cummings has done when he went into 10 Downing Street is to basically say, I'm the big I am. He's got this kind of Promethean idea of who he is, almost like he's somebody from sort of Greek mythology, a figure from an Ayn Rand novel where he single-handedly is going to create this huge, enduring national legacy. That's not how history works. That is not how it works. The great man theory of history, peddled by people like Thomas Carlyle, no doubt a great hero to Dominic Cummings, a conservative writer in the mid-19th century. They might have thought that. Maybe that was a little bit more true back then, although it probably wasn't. It's certainly not true in the 21st century. To get things done, you have to be able to bring people together. You have to be able to pacify dissent. You have to be able to put your ego aside to get the best out of those around you. Dominic Cummings was incapable pathologically at all of that. That said, they may miss him next time round at a general election because that's where he does excel. He's very good at compartmentalizing problems, at not, the exact same things which undermine his leadership style in power, not listening to dissent, tunnel vision, singly focused on a particular target. That doesn't work when you're trying to manage number 10 Downing Street and you've not got a general election for 4 years. But come 2024, it might be a really useful skill to have. So he may come back into the picture then. But I think for now, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are much better off from their own point of view without him.
No, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think it's quite likely they will get him back in for the general election because he does seem to have an understanding of the electorate that many people in Westminster don't. He definitely called it right when it came to proroguing Parliament, for example, when everyone else had kind of got that wrong, I think. A couple of super chats. Nishat, 1976. With $9.99. Thank you very much. Sadly, I don't think many Tory voters care about this kind of unfairness and other corruption stories. It's all background noise now. I think that's quite possibly true. I mean, in terms of background noise can matter, but it only matters if it's repeated enough by the mainstream press. So I don't think voters actually really cared about whether or not Jeremy Corbyn had recognised a trope in a mural. But because they heard so often, the words Corbyn and anti-Semitism in the same sentence, that background noise became important. And I think that the same here. If you had a press that was running daily with stories about Tory corruption scandals, then people would start to associate, Tories, corruption. But because it's just, one story here, one story there, and it doesn't really get picked up, I don't think it will make that much difference. I think, obviously Cummings was the exception because that was a rule everyone followed. Everyone was following that rule. Everyone understood the sacrifice that they were making in March, and they understood that Dominic Cummings had done something different, and then that Boris Johnson was gaslighting them all by saying that actually he followed the rule. There was something really, really primal about that, the anger that people had at Dominic Cummings there, and which doesn't apply to these. So it does all, I think, depend on whether or not the press decide to pick it up, and we know that they tend to be fairly inconsistent in that which they do pick up. Dara O'Byrne with a £5, really great message. I'm a teacher, well, not great because it's unfortunate, but I'm a teacher just tested positive due to an unapproved student party over the weekend causing an outbreak. Goodbye Christmas, time to binge my Novara backlog. Well, I'm delighted about your choice of how to spend your Christmas indoors. All I can say is, I suppose, solidarity. And also, I do think it hasn't been said enough that teachers in this country, because I've been someone who've been, there's lots of people who said because there's a danger in schools, they should be closed down. And I've had more of the position of, look, this is actually a difficult problem. I've spoken to teachers myself who said, to be honest, if you look at how far back the kids fell during that first lockdown, we have no choice really but to reopen. So I'm, I wasn't opposed to schools reopening for most of this term. But I think the corollary of that should have been that we recognise that teachers, by going into schools, which clearly, whatever the government tells you, are not remotely safe from coronavirus, are doing a massive service to everyone else in this country by educating kids and taking risks which most of us aren't. Some people in care are taking similar risks, but most of us, people who can work from home or people who work in offices with not many people, we don't have to take the same risks that teachers do in schools, and they are getting sick. And all we hear from the government is still basically castigating teachers as sort of work shy, lazy people who don't really care about kids, which couldn't be further from the truth. So solidarity for having caught COVID, and to all teachers. I think we should all be, displaying a lot of gratitude to what they have been doing over the past few months. We are going to go to our final story. Before that, please do like this video. It helps us on the algorithm. Official figures released yesterday show 1,264 people died from drug-related causes in Scotland last year. The figure is a 6% rise on the previous year, and Scotland, by a long way, already had the highest level of drug-related deaths for any country in Europe. We can get up this graph from the BBC, which was widely shared yesterday because it's so shocking. You can see here the number of drug deaths per capita in every European country, and you can see that Scotland is far and away the highest. The United Kingdom comes in third, but you can see Scotland there has 3 times as many drug deaths per capita than the United Kingdom. Now, the BBC do sort of say we should be clear that there are differences in terms of reporting from other countries. You can see here that the number of drug deaths in Scotland has risen dramatically since 2000, and because of particularly the increase in use of I'm not sure there's been an increase in the use of heroin, but there has been an increase in the use of benzodiazepines, and especially their combination with heroin has caused a huge surge in drug deaths. We are going to speak now, I think, to Paul Sweeney. Paul Sweeney was a former MP in Glasgow North East until the SNP won back the seat in 2019. Paul has been working for a project which is sort of putting safe consumption vans in the middle of cities so that people can take drugs more safely than they otherwise would. We're going to talk about that project in a bit more detail in a moment. First of all, Paul, though, thank you for joining us on the show. Could you explain a bit why Scotland has this specific problem? Why is it why are drug deaths so much more common in Scotland than elsewhere?
Well, it's nice to see you again, Michael. It's a particularly problematic issue in Scotland because of historical issues, actually, pertaining to patterns of intravenous drug use going back 20, 30 years, but that's not the whole story. We're actually seeing an increasing number of people dying who are below the age of 40. And that's really concerning. And a large part of that, like you indicated in some of the graphs that you showed just before you introduced me, is largely driven by street Valium or benzodiazepines. And there's a real concern that it's a combination of methadone use, taking Valium, street Valium, bought usually for as little as 50p a pill outside a pub, on a high street. Combine that with alcohol, that can collapse someone's airway and effectively suffocate. That's the sort of deaths that we're seeing increasingly in Scotland. It's not the classic sort of train spotting sort of 90s generation that were maybe like injecting heroin and overdosing and then just using a single type of drug. It's this more complex picture of sort of chaotic lifestyles combined with this multi or polydrug use that's driving the spike in drug deaths. And there's a particular concern that the Scottish Government have cut significantly drug and alcohol partnerships, particularly addiction services, in the last 10 years. There's been a significant cut of over 55% in addiction services in Scotland, which is correlated strongly with this increase in deaths. But also we've seen changes to protocols for prescribing drugs like acetazolam and Valium in GP surgeries across Scotland, which has made it much harder to have it on prescription. And we think that that's probably driving people onto the streets to sort of purchase it illicitly. And of course, those doses aren't controlled. This is people doing it in pill presses, selling it illegally on the streets. Gangsters taking advantage of that demand. And that's, that uncontrolled environment is causing a big factor in the increase in deaths. That's why with the drug consumption ban, the idea is to bring it back under greater control. Obviously, ultimately, I'd like to decriminalise drug possession and actually regulate its production and supply. And that would actually make things much safer, because we need to accept that this is a lived reality in our society. And this kind of old Victorian attitude we have towards it needs to go.
I think we can probably get up in a moment some footage of your. I suppose it was not quite a demonstration, was it, outside the Scottish Parliament? But you took the safe consumption van outside the Scottish government to sort of get attention for it. Was it a demonstration?
Well, it was. I suppose it's the entire purpose of this pilot that we've been doing for the last 9 months or so is to demonstrate that it's actually an incredibly straightforward intervention. You can see there, this is just a converted minibus with 2 booths there with sterile equipment. So you've got safe needles, you've got swabs, and you've got naloxone, which is, of course, the antidote for heroin overdoses. So you can immediately reverse a heroin overdose if you find someone in that situation. And we've already actually reversed an overdose just in the last 3 months and saved someone's life in the streets of Glasgow by doing that. Just simply the virtue of the fact that they're being supervised and not doing it alone means if they do have a situation where they've overdosed, that can be immediately reversed and they can get professional medical intervention. So the purpose of the event today was really just to, after the announcement of the figures, the unprecedented death rates that we'd seen in the last year, 2019, being announced in Parliament, we were pretty unsatisfied with the response of the Public Health Minister in Scotland, Joe Fitzpatrick. So we decided to take the van over to the Scottish Parliament, park it outside, because he's steadfastly refused to engage with us. He's not wanted to come and visit it. Other politicians have, including the Scottish Labour Shadow Health Secretary has come to visit. Other MSPs and MPs from cross parties, including the SNP, have came to visit. We're just aghast that the Scottish Government are being more proactive in pushing this, because what we've actually found is the police have nothing to charge us with. And as a matter of fact, the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act is silent when it comes to this particular issue of injecting drugs. It certainly makes cannabis cafes illegal and it makes opium dens illegal, but any other drug consumption of it per se is not illegal. And the act of possessing it is illegal. But we know that increasingly police forces across the UK are not prosecuting routinely small-scale drug possession because they recognise it's a futile act. It's much better to try and divert people into more productive therapies and treat it more as a public health issue. So we don't see in that context why the Public Health Minister wouldn't be all up for advancing this intervention, which is one of the rare public policy opportunities where you can save money and save lives. It's exasperating, really. So the idea was to take this thing right to the front door of Parliament and say, please come down and have a look at it. You're on £100,000 a year and you're flailing here. And, there's a public health crisis where every 31 hours someone is dying in Glasgow of a preventable drug-related death. In Scotland as a whole, every 7 hours someone is dying of a preventable drug-related death. Shocking statistics. it's a double pandemic, if you like. When you look at the context of COVID, look at the sense of urgency we've had around that. Why aren't we having the same sense of urgency around this issue? And I imagine the figures for the last year, including the lockdown year, if you like, will be far worse next year as well. It's only going in one direction without serious national intervention. And of course, this is a crisis across the UK. The trends are going up, of course, across the UK, but it's particularly acute in Scotland, where, as you saw, it's 3 times higher, and it's actually 1,000% higher than the European average, which is a shocking statistic.
And this is clearly going to, it already has become a partisan issue. You're a former Labour MP, you're standing to be a Labour MSP. So, you've talked about funding cuts or difficulties with prescribing from GPs. The argument I've heard the SNP put forward, and again, it seems like a fairly powerful one, is that the root problem here is the criminalisation of drugs. If you want sort of a comparison of a country which had a similar problem with drug deaths, it was Portugal in the 80s and 90s, and the way that they solved that very effectively was full drug decriminalisation. And the SNP, as far as I understand, are in favour of full drug decriminalisation. So are Scottish Labour. But because of the union, because it's very difficult to get this particular policy past the English electorate, then the Scottish government are really working with one hand behind their back. And to me, this could seem like a pretty powerful argument for independence. It's one issue where the Scottish government, where the SNP and, to be fair to Scottish Labour as well, are in favour of a much more sort of enlightened, liberal public health policy that isn't so acceptable south of the border. But because Britain is more small c conservative than the Scots, you're stuck with a policy platform or policy programme, policy framework that isn't working. So for you, as someone who's against Scottish independence, do you see this is going to become a problem for unionists in Scotland, or do you think that there is a way where decriminalisation can be sort of brought about either in reality or in effect whilst the union remains?
Well, I think it's an interesting challenge, and it's certainly a point that's been put forward by a lot of partisans on this issue, and it's quite depressing.
You're partisan as well, come on, Paul.
Well, yeah, I'm partisan in the sense that, I've got a wider political view of things, but really, I didn't have a particular interest in drugs policy until I realised the scale of the carnage that was going on in the streets, speaking to people who use drugs in Glasgow, and it moved me to action really on an evidence-based policy. And I think also looking at it from a Westminster point of view, when I was making speeches in the House of Commons about this, I recognise, the Home Office are a severe impediment to progress. Ultimately, decriminalisation is an evidence-based solution. But the reality is that, in effect, decriminalisation has been de facto implemented in places across the UK. In fact, the West Midlands, for example, are leading the way on this. The Police and Crime Commissioner there is already looking at setting up a safe injecting space, and that's probably going to happen before it happens in Scotland officially. So, there's ways and means of pushing the frontiers of devolved power. And I think you've seen it expertly done by people like Andy Burnham in recent weeks, where you can really push back on specific issues and make specific challenges to allow things to progress. And I think that's what we need to do increasingly across the UK, to try and improve things, building alliances rather than trying to sort of focus on division. And I think that's the way we can proceed, is in a collaborative way. I also think it's critical to note that with respect to safe drug consumption, we're now increasingly confident that there's no legislative impediment to this, that we can crack on and do it now. This experiment we've done for the last 3 months has not resulted in us being charged. It's not resulted in a prosecution. That demonstrates the law is silent on it. What actually I think is happening is a cynical attempt to turn it into a wedge issue in the Constitution, which kind of you outlined. And I think what we actually really need is to specifically outline where we can do progress. And let's say, I'm all for the idea of devolution of drugs policy. Let's do it. What's the point of having it centralised, actually? I'm increasingly now of the view that that's a positive progression. These are conversations that are mature and they can be had in an evidence-based, discussion. And I think rather than trying to turn it into this kind of constant refrain back to the this constitutional schism isn't helpful for us, and I think it's actually leads back to a fairly cynical form of politics. I think it's actually far better for us to have an issue by issue based debate about this. Where do powers best lie? Where are they best exercised? But actually, the Scottish government doing enough of what they've got, and I don't think they are, and that's why the agitation was directed towards the Scottish government. This is about public health. It's about NHS policy, which is fully devolved. It's about addiction services, fully devolved. And it's about how you actually implement a criminal justice system, which again is fully devolved in Scotland. So these are all, fronts upon which progress can be achieved. But we don't feel that the Scottish government are going far enough. And I have to say, this is including SNP supporters. I've had people like Michael Gray, for example, from Scotia, you might know, in Commonweal, saying the same thing. We've had people like Kenny McCaskill, former Scottish Justice Minister, SNP MP now, saying the same thing. The Scottish Government are actually being incredibly conservative when it comes to reform, because I think they don't want to upset Middle Scotland as well. They've got to hold together a very fragile coalition in Scotland, behind their party. And I think they think ultimately drug users don't vote is not a great there's not a great benefit in pandering to this agenda. And I think that's probably what their calculation is. Call me cynical, but I have to say I entered into this debate in good faith. It's taken me about 2 years to arrive at this situation where I'm saying, is this really a meaningful progress, or has it actually just been used as a wedge issue? I'm pretty irritated at the fact there's not been enough progress. We've presented a ready-made solution in the form of this pilot that we've done with this van with Peter Crichton and I, and yet the minister can't even come and look at it. I mean, he's on 100 grand a year. What's he doing in there in that parliament every day?
Paul Sweeney, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm hoping we're going to get you on with an SNP person soon, so we can have a bit of a Barney there. Yeah. And my apologies that I didn't have a script for the first half of this section, so it's a bit more chaotic than I wanted it to be. But so nice to speak to you again. Speak to you soon, Paul.
Nice to see you. Okay.
A couple more comments. Video archive with 525. Michael, please wish a happy birthday to my brother Jack. He introduced me to Navarra and is a great brother. We all love Tysky Sour. Happy birthday, Jack, and thank you for the very nice message and that donation. Aaron, I want to bring you in for a final comment, which is I was seeing some tweets today saying a Brexit deal is done. Tom Kibasi tweeted he's got a contact in Brussels who says a Brexit deal's done, very much unconfirmed. But do you think by the end of the week we're going to find out that Brexit's basically resolved and everyone can relax for Christmas? Well, not relax because we'll be concerned about COVID, but relax about Brexit for Christmas.
It's a tough one. I think a deal will be done, but at this stage, Chinese whispers and he said, she said probably isn't the most reliable way of informing one's own opinion. Intuitively, I think we probably agree on this, Michael. I think we're of a mind with Tom as well, who's been a pretty good observer on this entire issue for years. That there will be a deal. But I can kind of see in my mind's eye now Laura Kuenssberg tweeting, a dramatic last-minute Brexit deal has been done. Nobody said it could be achieved. This is a huge political triumph for Boris Johnson. This will define his premiership. And this is classical Laura Kuenssberg journalism. What she'll do is she'll say, this thing has happened and this is what it means. Wait, hold on. You're not there to determine the historic conclusion with the breaking story. It's kind of really bad journalism. Of course, she's allowed to editorialize within certain parameters, but she always takes it too far. So keep your eyes peeled for that. When there is a deal, 99.9% sure, maybe there won't be a deal and we're going to look ridiculous in a couple of weeks, Michael, but we both think there probably will be a deal. I think almost as important is going to be the response from people like Robert Peston and Laura Kuenssberg. High drama. And like you say, of course, they're players within it. And so they aren't really adequate to covering this properly because, of course, they're key instruments of the government effectively waging, a kind of information propaganda war against the public at large. They are trying to tell us a deal isn't happening, and that if it does, it will be against all the odds. And the means by which they're doing this is briefing favourable journalists, who, by the way, are meant to be serving us, not the politicians.
And it's also, this doesn't need to be conspiratorial because the whole point is both are benefiting from it. Robert Peston and Laura Kuenssberg love the drama because that obviously makes better TV than saying, look, we actually think this is probably all a bit of a farce. And essentially the outlines of the deal were all but there for the last 2 months, but they just had to make it dramatic. If they said that, then that would undermine the news report. So there's sort of this mutual interest involved in Laura Kuenssberg and Robert Peston playing up the drama and Boris Johnson playing up the drama, even if this is all sort of like a real high-level ideology which is being propounded from our from public service broadcasters and from our politicians.
Again, it boils down to the fact that because we have the BBC in this country, our sort of political media culture is yes, of course, the tabloids play a huge role, but television and radio really is extraordinarily large. If you compare that to the German media landscape, where there's a far greater emphasis on print media, they purely by virtue of the medium that the conversations are being taken through, i.e. print media, it's a much more sober, informed assessment of things. And I think television necessarily lends itself to, this is a moment of drama. I don't want to be entertained, Laura Kuenssberg. This is not a reality TV show. You're a political editor. Let's tone it down, inform the audience, and please stop doing the bidding of the Prime Minister. That isn't your job. So I think it's partly the politics, it's partly the ideology, and it's partly this emphasis on broadcast media in Britain. I think put it together, we've got a really toxic mix.
If you like TV that does cut through the crap, that doesn't just do the Prime Minister's job for him, you know what to do. Go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or as Ash described in that video we showed in the middle, the current phase of our sort of attempt to sort of put ourselves on solid foundation for the coming year is to try and get more subscribers. You answered our call when we tried to increase the amount of income we get per month to, or buy £5,000. We did that thanks to your support. We are so grateful for that. Now what we want to do is get 500 new subscribers. So do spread the word. If you're not already a supporter on our website, please make sure you become one, however much money you can afford. If you already are one, think about. I mean, we still don't have it set up so you can get someone else's subscription for Christmas, but you can, encourage people to do that as we go into a new year. For now, Aaron, it's been a pleasure as always.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. You've been a typically superb host. That little blip you had with the Sweeney segment, don't take it personally.
I think people knew, you knew I had notes, right, guys? That didn't sort of break the drama. Everyone has notes. Anyway, we're going to wrap up then. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.